Hey minions, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and on this episode of Action Awareness, I want to talk about High Ground of the Bear Cavalry. High Ground is a play on base action that you should disenchant on sight because it has the ongoing ability to destroy any opposing minion that moves there, so long as you have a minion there. This is one of the most annoyingly powerful cards in the game, and is meant to be exploited as much as possible. It's hard not to think of a synergy with this card that doesn't result in someone flipping the table. The destruction only requires a minion on the high ground base, which is not hard to do. My personal choice is the Polar Commando, as he himself cannot be destroyed as long as it's your only minion you have there, and you should only be putting a single minion on the high ground base. High ground exists to make your opponent's life a living nightmare, and it's so easy to rack up destructions with this action. I'm somewhat convinced that, if this card were made today, it would be nerfed considerably. Then again, the Bear Cavalry got a Titan, so who knows what would happen. There are a couple of nuances to this ability. You, as the controller, always get credit for the destruction because you are the one destroying the minion. You do not have to be the player who moves the minion, however. In fact, it doesn't matter how the minion moves, so long as it is moved there. And this creates a ton of opportunities, as if the Bear Cavalry didn't have enough. I like to use High Ground as a staging base for a 4-3-2, of which there are plenty. Conceptually, the recurring destruction will make players want to just play their minions there to break that base and be done with it, and this is an easy way to get a solid second place. Players have no incentive to play on other bases because the Bear Cavalry would just move them, and you have 3 copies, none of which can power cap the movement. Add in the fact that you have 2 copies of You're Screwed, 2 copies of Commission, which also moves opposing minions, and you're pretty much borscht, and you have at least 8 opportunities to send a minion to a high ground death. And this is before they got the Titan, which gives you even more recurring movement, though thankfully it is power capped. Though most of those cards only affect one player, High Ground makes the Bear Cavalry extremely strong. If a player is competing with you on a base, you not only push them off, but send them to their death. And it shuts them down from playing powerful minions, because they can become easy targets for High Ground. This is a card where the threat of the card is almost as powerful as the card itself. But High Ground doesn't just trigger from the Bear Cavalry, and this is where it gets brutal. Felicia Day can destroy all opposing minions on all other bases. Let me repeat that. All opposing minions on all other bases. Yokozuna can smack minion after minion into the high ground base and prevents your own minions from being moved off the base. In fact, if you simply play superiority on the high ground base, it's really hard to kick the minion off outside of scoring. Factions that take advantage of movement really suffer, especially when it's mandatory like the sheep. My personal favorite way to get someone to flip the table is to play this action on Mushroom Kingdom. Because the base is doing the movement, it's really hard to block this, and players have no choice but to break this base as quickly as possible, outside of a few specific counters. And where this gets really crazy is that neither player involved in the transaction needs to be the high ground player. In one of the worst, most annoying tournament games I've ever played, it was a 4-player match with Mushroom Kingdom and High Ground out. The other players were inexplicably playing minions on other bases, thinking that they would survive, and every player was Mushroom Kingdoming the previous player's minion. I was the only one trying to break the base, and I was followed by the Bear Cavalry player, who would move me off, then the next player would Mushroom Kingdom me. It was absolute chaos, and locked the game up for several consecutive turns. In fact, several bases can combine really well with High Ground, because they create another variable that highlights the area control nature of this card. I think the awesome level 9000 bases are often good fits, too good it seems. First, Field of Honor can be a VP factory, and if that didn't provide enough of an incentive for a player to rush the breaking of that base, I don't know what will. Either you get an easy 2 points, or you get a ton of VP, and then an easy 2 points as the player realizes they should have done it sooner. Czar's Palace makes for a great base to not be the high ground base, as Czar's Palace forces the playing of higher powered minions, which you can send into the high ground base. Haunted House really penalizes players for playing there, and it's a 4-3-2 base, so a player is going to have to give you an easy 3 points and spend a ton of cards doing it. With Workshop, it's possible to set up a high ground and your pretty much borscht combo in a single turn and they'd never see it coming. Winning Inventor Salon gives you back your pretty much borscht to play it again with high ground being on a separate base. And these are just the bases from that set. You pretty much guarantee yourself uncontested points on Ice Castle because they cannot rush the completion of that base. In fact, I love putting high ground on Ice Castle with Snow White and just leaving her there because any minion you play is getting destroyed unless you can do something about it. With the Princess movement, this is actually really easy to set up. As I mentioned before, you need to disenchant this action. The alternative is to force the breaking of that base, but this doesn't always work. If someone piles a bunch of minions on the high ground base hoping to break it, El Bandito can transfer the action to his base, then play your pretty much borscht to send the minions who are supposed to be avoiding high ground into high ground. You can then restore high ground to its original base and continue to reap the benefits of having a base isolated. The problem with high ground is that it is powerful enough to be extremely annoying with just the Bear Cavalry, but there are synergies that make this even worse. And on top of that, it also functions as a counter too. It can shut down factions that rely on movement as part of their value. In fact, this actually once kept a first mate combo from being near infinite in a two-player game, because the other base that was in play was too high a breakpoint to break with all the first mates. But if he went to the high ground base, they'd be destroyed. I forget the exact power, but I remember that we checked the deck, and the majority of the bases could have been destroyed uncontested, and he only needed 2 to win the game. High ground turns the Great White Shark into mutually assured destruction and shuts down the Ram and Cyclone. High ground can shut down Palooza. It can block the Pirate King and Dust Devils from latching on. There are more cards that exacerbate its effect than those that directly counter it other than Disenchants. For this reason, you have to draft a faction with action destruction just to get rid of this card. I will say, this is one time I do like the Steam Queen, as the Steam Queen high ground superiority combo can be brutal. And because the Steampunks can add power, any minion that gets played on the Steam Queen base can get sent into a powered up Cub Scout. This card is definitely a magnet for high powered minions, and while that is very powerful, it still results in something incredibly annoying, so be careful with your audience. This is definitely a take that card that new players should not experience because they will likely quit the game forever. Lastly, I feel like Turing Jedi will give me a hard time if I don't point out the Star Wars reference with Ghost Knight being an excellent high ground candidate. He has low power and destruction immunity, which allows him to stay on the base for a long time. Personally, I fell asleep during episode 3, and I'm okay with that. There are cards that are powerful and cards that are annoying, and high ground is both. Use it responsibly. You may win the battle, but lose the player. It's happened in our group, but it turns out that we didn't want to play Smash Up with the person anyway, so if you're looking to turn a person off of the game, here's how you do it. What has been your experience with the card? Let me know in the comments. That's it for this week. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.